My name is Mara Ellison, and the first time my father laughed at me in court, he did it like he had been waiting 36 years for the right audience. It was a gray Tuesday morning in October, the kind of Minnesota morning where the cold slipped through your coat before you even reached the courthouse doors. I walked into Hennepin County Probate Court, carrying one gray document bag, the same one I used for work, with a broken zipper and a coffee stain near the handle. No attorney walked beside me. No husband held my hand. No friend sat behind me whispering that I would be okay. Across the aisle, my father, Graham Ellison, sat beside my older brother, Troy, both of them dressed like men, arriving to collect something already promised. Between them stood Bennett Cross, one of the most expensive probate litigators in Minneapolis. I knew his hourly rate because Troy had bragged about it in a text meant to intimidate me. $950 an hour. My father looked at my empty table, then at my bag, then at me. "No lawyer?" he said, loud enough for the first two rows to hear. Troy leaned back and smiled. My father shook his head softly, almost tenderly, as if he pitied me. "You're finished, Mara." A few people turned. Someone near the back coughed to cover a laugh. Bennett Cross did not laugh. He only adjusted his cuffs, calm and polished, certain the morning would go exactly the way his clients had paid for. Then Judge Marisol Keene opened my file. At first, she skimmed. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved back to the top of the page. She turned another sheet. Then another. Bennett noticed before my father did. The judge handed him a copy. He read 3 lines, and every bit of color left his face. My father frowned. "What is it?" Bennett did not answer right away. He just looked at me like he had finally realized I had not come alone. I had brought the one thing my family never respected. My record. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support me. I want to ask you something. In life, what do you fear most? Betrayal or being looked down upon? If you fear betrayal, type 1. If you fear being looked down upon, type 2. Today's story contains both of those pains and an ending that will leave many speechless. But before that file ever reached the courtroom, before Bennett Cross learned to stop smiling, I was the quiet daughter in a house where quiet was treated like proof that I had nothing worth saying. I grew up in Maple Grove, Minnesota, in a split-level house with beige siding, a 2-car garage, and a father who believed sons were investments and daughters were obligations. My older brother, Troy, was 3 years ahead of me, and somehow always 3 steps ahead in my father's heart. Graham Ellison called him my boy, in the grocery store, at church breakfasts, at Little League games, even after Troy had grown too old to be anybody's boy without embarrassment. When Troy failed algebra, Dad said school was too rigid for practical minds. When Troy backed the family truck into our neighbor's mailbox, Dad laughed and said every man learned by denting something. When Troy lost money from the cash drawer at Dad's construction office, it became a lesson in responsibility. When I found an error on one of Dad's supplier invoices at 14, it became an accusation. I remember standing in the kitchen with the paper in my hands, trying to explain that he had been charged twice for the same lumber delivery. $812. I still remember the exact number, because numbers stayed with me even when people didn't. Dad stared at me like I had corrected him in public. "Why are you always looking for something wrong?" he asked. Troy smirked from the table and said, "She's doing her little calculator act again." That was the first time I understood that being right did not matter if the truth made the wrong person uncomfortable. Years later, people would pay me to find fraud hidden inside clean-looking records. Back then, it only made me difficult. My mother, Janine, saw more than she admitted. She was not cruel, and I won't pretend she was. She was tired. She had spent so long keeping my father calm that silence had become her way of surviving him. When he criticized me, she folded dish towels. When Troy mocked me, she reached for another plate. Peace, in our house, usually meant I swallowed something sharp. The only person who never asked me to make myself smaller was my grandmother, Ruth Calder. Ruth lived in Street Paul, in a brick house that smelled like peppermint tea and old paper. She had built 3 neighborhood pharmacies before selling them and investing quietly, carefully, better than most men who called themselves businessmen. On Saturday afternoons, I sat beside her while she balanced accounts with a fountain pen. One day, after my father called me cold, Ruth looked over her glasses and tapped the page between us. "Numbers don't make you cold, Mara," she said. "They make you harder to fool." I did not know it then, but that was the first piece of armor anyone ever gave me. That armor did not feel like armor at first. It felt like loneliness, the kind that came from seeing what other people worked very hard not to see. Ruth was the first person who made me wonder if that did not make me difficult. Maybe it made me useful. It was late February of 2020 when Troy's used RV business started bleeding money. He called it recession, proof travel freedom. My father called it a real opportunity. After looking at the numbers for 5 minutes, I called it debt with tires, but only in my head. By then, I had learned that truth was safest when it stayed quiet until it had documents beside it. The dinner happened at my father's house on a Sunday night, while snow melted in gray piles along the driveway. Janine made pot roast, the meal she cooked when she wanted everyone to behave. Ruth sat across from me in a navy cardigan, her cane hooked over the back of her chair. She was 79, slower than before, but her eyes were clear. Too clear for the way Graham and Troy had begun speaking to her. They did not ask her things anymore. They explained them to her. "Mom," my father said, cutting his meat into careful pieces, "you've got assets sitting idle. At your age, simplification matters." Ruth looked at him. "Simplification for whom?" Troy laughed too fast. "Grandma, nobody's taking anything. Dad's just saying family money should help family when it can." There it was, family money, not Ruth's money. Not money she had earned over 40 years. Family money. After dessert, Graham brought out a folder and placed it beside Ruth's coffee cup. "Just a transfer authorization," he said. "Nothing dramatic." I saw the bank header before Ruth touched the page. Then I saw the amount. $275,000. The signature line was still blank. The destination account was tied to Ellison Siteworks, my father's construction company. I did not raise my voice. Raising your voice gives people permission to talk about your tone instead of their lie. I only looked at Ruth and asked, "Did anyone explain where this money is going?" The fork in Troy's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. My father's jaw tightened. "Mara, don't start." Troy leaned back. "Don't turn dinner into an audit." Ruth picked up the paper, read one line, then another, and folded it once down the middle. "Graham," she said quietly, "take me home." That night, my phone rang at 10:43. Ruth's voice was steady, but lower than usual. "If one day they say I don't know what I'm signing," she asked, "would you know how to prove otherwise?" I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said. "I would." The next morning, I called Ruth before work and told her the only advice I was qualified to give. "Get your own attorney," I said. "Not Dad's, not Troy's, someone who has never had dinner with us, never taken a phone call from Graham, and never owed this family anything." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say." 2 weeks later, I drove her to a law office in downtown Street Paul, on the 3rd floor of an old stone building with brass elevator doors and carpet that smelled faintly of rainwater and paper. Her attorney was Helen Whitcomb, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of calm that made people sit straighter without realizing it. I did not go into the conference room. That mattered. I sat outside near a window with my laptop open, answering work emails while Ruth met with Helen alone. When the receptionist asked if I wanted coffee, I said yes, mostly so I would have something to do with my hands. Twice, Helen stepped out and asked Ruth questions privately. Twice, Ruth answered without looking toward me. I wanted distance. I wanted clean lines. I wanted a record no one could smear later. At the time, I was already working in forensic accounting, mostly corporate fraud and insurance disputes. I had seen what happened when families mixed money with memory and called it love. I had also seen what happened when one person did the building and another appeared at the end with a moral claim and an empty hand. Over the next several months, Ruth reviewed everything: the medical building and street, Paul, the investment accounts, the certificates of deposit, and the Brainerd cabin with green shutters and a dock she still paid someone to repair every spring. Together, the assets were worth more than $6 million, though Ruth never said the number like it mattered more than the purpose. She did not rush. She asked about taxes, maintenance, insurance, tenant leases, nursing scholarships, and what would happen if Troy tried to force a sale. Helen answered each question slowly. Ruth took notes in blue ink. I drove her to appointments, but I never sat in. Sometimes afterward we stopped for soup near Summit Avenue, and Ruth talked about the weather or the Vikings, never the trust details. But in July, she touched my wrist across the table and said, "Promise me you won't let them turn everything I built into emergency money for men who never learned consequence." I looked at her hand. Thin skin, strong grip. "I promise," I said. I did not know the trust was already written. I did not know it named me as trustee. I only knew Ruth was preparing for a fight she hoped would never come. Ruth died on a Thursday morning in June of 2024, just after sunrise, while Street Paul was still quiet enough for birds to sound louder than traffic. Helen Whitcomb called me first. Not because I was the most emotional person in the family, but because Ruth had written my name on the contact sheet herself. I sat on the edge of my bed, with the phone pressed to my ear, looking at a pale square of light on the floor, and for a few seconds I forgot how to breathe like an adult. The funeral was exactly what Ruth had wanted. Small chapel. No expensive flowers. No speeches long enough to become performances. Graham cried where people could see him. Troy stood near the back, checking his phone behind the folded program. I stood by the aisle and remembered the way Ruth used to press receipts flat with her palm before she signed anything, as if even paper deserved to be handled with care. 2 weeks later, we gathered in Helen's office for the reading. Troy arrived in a new charcoal blazer and carried coffee from a place he probably could not afford. Graham sat beside him, quiet but alert, his fingers tapping the arm of the chair in that old rhythm I had known since childhood. Janine sat near the window with her purse clutched in both hands. I took the chair farthest from the desk and folded my hands in my lap. Helen began with personal items. A watch went to a retired pharmacist Ruth had mentored. A box of recipe cards went to my mother. Several pieces of jewelry were designated for charity auction. Troy shifted in his seat, as if anything that could not be sold quickly was wasting his time. Then Helen turned the page. The Ruth Calder Trust, amended and restated July 22, 2020, shall continue according to the following terms. Troy finally looked up. Helen read calmly. The medical building in Street Paul would remain inside the trust. The investment accounts would support taxes, maintenance, and a nursing scholarship fund. The Brainerd cabin was not to be sold without trustee approval. Then Helen said my name. Mara Ellison is appointed primary trustee. For a moment, the room went still, as if the words had to travel through everyone twice before they became real. Troy laughed first. One short, ugly sound. Graham leaned forward. "Read that again." Helen did. My father's face changed slowly, not into grief, and not into shock, into insult. "She got to you," he said, though Ruth was no longer there to answer. Then he turned to me. "You finally found a way to turn her against us." I looked at him and understood. He was not mourning Ruth's decision. He was mourning his loss of access. In the parking lot, Troy threw his coffee cup into the trash, so hard the lid flew off. "We sue," he said. Graham stared at me through the windshield of his truck. "No," he answered. "We bury her." 3 weeks later, the petition arrived in a thick white envelope, with my name typed so formally it almost felt personal. I found it in my mailbox after work, wedged between a grocery flyer and a water bill, as if my father's attempt to strip me of Ruth's trust was just another piece of ordinary mail. I stood in the apartment hallway, with my keys still in my hand, and read the return address twice. Bennett Cross and Associates, I knew the name before I opened it. Anyone who worked near financial disputes in Minneapolis knew Bennett Cross, probate litigation, estate contests, high net worth family fights dressed up in legal language. He was the kind of attorney people hired when they wanted intimidation to arrive on letterhead. Inside was the story my father and brother had decided to tell about me. According to them, I had isolated Ruth. I had placed myself near her during a vulnerable period. I had used my knowledge of accounts and financial systems to confuse an elderly woman into giving me control. The petition used words like manipulation, dependency, undue influence, and breach of family trust. I carried the envelope to my kitchen table and laid each page out in order. Complaint. Supporting affidavit. Proposed temporary order. Request to suspend trustee authority pending review. There it was. The first real move. They did not just want to challenge Ruth's decision. They wanted me frozen before I could protect anything. Troy's affidavit was the loudest. He described himself as Ruth's devoted grandson, though I knew he had visited her 4 times in her final 8 months. Graham's was colder. He called me calculating, detached, unnaturally involved in financial matters. I circled that phrase with a red pen. Unnaturally involved. That was what they called competence when it belonged to a woman they had spent years dismissing. My phone rang at 8:17 that night. Dad. I let it ring 4 times before answering. You still have time to fix this, he said. No greeting. Fix what? Sign a resignation as trustee. Let the court appoint someone neutral. We can keep this from getting uglier. Behind his voice, I heard Troy say something low. I looked at the petition spread across my table. The accusations, the signatures, the clean legal language, trying to make greed look reasonable. You already made it ugly, I said. Dad exhaled sharply. Don't embarrass this family. For the first time that night, I smiled. You did that before I ever got the envelope. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of October, and by then, Graham had already convinced himself that court would do what he had never managed to do at home. Put me back in my place. I arrived early, because old habits from forensic work were hard to break. When you were reviewing fraud files, the person who showed up late usually spent the rest of the day reacting. I did not want to react. I wanted to observe. Courtroom 4B was colder than it needed to be. The lights hummed softly overhead. The benches smelled faintly of wool coats, old paper, and coffee carried in from the hallway. I set my gray document bag on the table and removed only one folder. Not the thickest one. Not the most important one. Just enough to make myself look ordinary. That was intentional. Graham and Troy came in 10 minutes later with Bennett Cross between them, polished and expensive, his leather briefcase shining like a warning. Troy saw me first. His eyes went straight to the empty chair beside me. No counsel? He asked, smiling. I did not answer. Graham gave a quiet laugh, the kind meant to travel farther than his voice. Still stubborn. Bennett Cross glanced at me with professional courtesy. Miss Ellison, you understand the seriousness of today's proceeding? I do. And you are still choosing to appear without representation? I am. Troy leaned toward my father and whispered, not quietly enough. This is going to be embarrassing. He was right. Just not for me. When Judge Marisol Keene entered, everyone stood. She moved with the calm of someone who had watched families turn grief into litigation for decades and had stopped being impressed by volume. Bennett began smoothly, laying out the petition as if it were common sense. He spoke about vulnerability, proximity, financial sophistication, and an elderly woman whose trust had been redirected into my control. He made it sound clean, reasonable, almost compassionate. Then he looked at my empty side of the table. Your Honor, my clients are deeply concerned that Miss Ellison, appearing alone today, does not fully appreciate the legal complexity of the matter before this court. Graham lowered his head to hide a smile. Judge Keene did not smile. She looked down at the file in front of her, then at a second packet the clerk had just placed beside it. Before we continue, she said, I want to clarify Miss Ellison's professional background. Bennett's expression barely changed, but his hand stopped moving over his notes. Nadine Keller, his own legal secretary, leaned in and slid a copied file toward him. He opened it. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then the second, then slower, over the third. 27 elder financial exploitation cases, certified fraud examiner credentials, expert testimony in probate-related disputes, training materials on suspicious transfer patterns. The color left his face in stages. Graham frowned. "What is it?" Bennett did not look at him. Judge Keene folded her hands. "She may not be an attorney, Mr. Cross," she said, "but this court will not mistake that for being unprepared." After that, the room did not become loud. It became careful. That was worse for Graham and Troy. Noise could be dismissed. Careful silence meant people were listening differently. Bennett Cross cleared his throat and adjusted his papers, but something in the rhythm of his hands had changed. He was still experienced, still polished, still dangerous, but he was no longer performing certainty. He was managing risk. His first witness was Lydia Mercer, the former director of the assisted living facility where Ruth had spent her final months. Lydia was in her late 50s, neatly dressed, with reading glasses hanging from a chain, and the tense smile of someone who wished she had never agreed to be helpful. Bennett guided her gently. He asked whether Ruth had needed assistance. Lydia said yes. He asked whether Ruth had become more dependent near the end. Lydia said that was common for residents her age. He asked whether I visited often. Lydia looked at me once. "Yes," she said. "Bennett. Let that word settle. And, in your observation, did Miss Ellison become closely involved in Mrs. Calder's affairs?" "She visited regularly," Lydia answered. "Would you say Mrs. Calder relied on her?" Lydia hesitated. "In some ways, yes." I watched Graham's shoulders loosen. Troy shifted back in his chair like the first brick had been placed in the wall they wanted to build around me. Then Judge Keene looked at me. "Miss Ellison, cross-examination." I stood with one folder. Not 5. Not a stack. 1. "Miss Mercer," I said, "you stated that my grandmother became more dependent near the end. Do you mean medically, financially, or legally?" Lydia blinked. "Medically, mostly." "Did you ever see me instruct her to sign a financial document?" "No." "Did you ever see me prevent anyone from visiting her?" "No." "Did you ever hear her say she was afraid of me?" "No." I opened the folder and handed copies to the clerk. "I'd like to direct your attention to your internal care notes from April 17th, 2024. Lydia's face changed before she read the page. She knew the note. People usually remember the truth when it appears in their own handwriting. I asked, "Did you write that Ruth Calder was alert, oriented, and requesting copies of her lease statements and property tax notices?" "Yes." "And on May 2nd, did you email Helen Whitcomb's office stating that Ruth was clear, insistent, and frustrated by family pressure?" Bennett looked down sharply. Lydia swallowed. "Yes." I paused long enough for the words to reach my father. "Family pressure," I repeated, "not pressure from me." "No," Lydia said softly. I closed the folder. "One last question. When you used the word dependent today, were you describing a woman who could not make decisions or a woman who needed help walking to dinner?" Lydia looked at Judge Keene, then back at me. "The second," she said. I nodded. "Thank you." As I sat down, I saw Troy's confidence thin for the first time. It was a small thing, a jaw tightening, a hand leaving the table. But I knew small things. Small things were where people hid the truth until they ran out of places to put it. Bennett tried to recover by moving quickly. Good attorneys do that. When one witness leaves a bad taste in the room, they bring in another before the silence settles. He called the next name with more force than necessary. Owen Price. The man who stepped forward was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a navy suit that looked careful rather than expensive. I recognized him immediately, though we had only spoken once before. He had worked at North Star Community Bank in Street. Paul, the branch Ruth used for years, because she liked that the tellers remembered her name. Owen raised his right hand, took the oath, and sat with both feet planted flat on the floor. Bennett approached him with caution. Mr. Price, you were employed by North Star Community Bank in February of 2020, correct? Yes. And you handled certain account inquiries for Mrs. Ruth Calder? That's correct. Bennett's goal was obvious. He wanted Owen to sound routine, boring, administrative. He wanted the court to believe every transaction around Ruth had been normal until I appeared and made it complicated. But banking records are not emotional. They do not care who sounds wounded. They do not soften themselves for fathers. When it was my turn, I stood and carried a single page to the podium. Mr. Price, I said, do you remember a transfer request made on February 26, 2020? He looked at the document, then nodded. Yes, how much was the requested transfer? $275,000. A sound moved through the courtroom, not loud enough to be called a gasp, but close. And where was that money supposed to go? Owen adjusted his glasses. An operating account connected to Ellison Siteworks. Graham shifted beside Troy. I did not look at him yet. Who initiated the request? Owen hesitated. Mr. Graham Ellison brought in the paperwork. Bennett stood. Objection. The document speaks for itself. Judge Keene looked at him. Overruled. He may answer. I continued. Did Ruth Calder personally confirm the purpose of that transfer? No. Why not? Owen glanced toward my father, then back to me. Because when I called her, she seemed unaware of the stated purpose. Graham leaned forward. That was for family expenses. Judge Keene's eyes moved to him once. He sat back. I handed Owen the memo. Did you write this note after that call? Yes. Would you read the final sentence? His voice was steady. Client appeared unaware of transfer purpose and did not authorize release of funds. The courtroom went still again. This time, Troy turned and looked at our father, not with confidence, but with the first dull edge of suspicion. I finally looked at Graham. For once, he did not look angry. He looked caught. Bennett asked for a short recess after Owen stepped down. He did it politely, with the controlled tone of a man who knew better than to show panic in front of a judge, but everyone in that courtroom understood what had happened. The case had stopped being about my supposed influence over Ruth. It had started becoming about what Graham had tried to move before Ruth could stop him. When we returned, Bennett looked as if he had spent 15 minutes learning something from his own clients that he should have been told months earlier. Troy would not look at him. My father sat very still. His hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. Judge Keene looked at me. Miss Ellison, you may proceed with your next exhibit. I stood and carried a slim folder to the clerk. This is an email chain produced during discovery, I said, between Graham Ellison, Troy Ellison, and Elliot Vance. Troy's head snapped up at Elliot's name. Elliot was our second cousin, a real estate broker in Eden Prairie with perfect teeth, and the kind of handshake that made you count your fingers afterward. He was not in court that morning. He did not need to be. His words were, the first email appeared on the screen. Elliot had sent it in August, 2 months after Ruth died. Attached was an offer from a private buyer for the Street Paul Medical Building, $2.6 million. Judge Keene glanced down at the appraisal in the record. The valuation submitted by the trustee lists that property at approximately $3.2 million. Yes, Your Honor, I said. A low murmur passed through the benches. I clicked to the next email. Troy had written back within 7 minutes. If Mara stays trustee, we're dead before Christmas. No one spoke. Then Graham's reply appeared beneath it. Then we make sure she doesn't. Troy stared at the screen as if the words had been written by someone who only looked like him. Graham's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. Bennett slowly removed his glasses and set them on the table. I turned to the court. This was sent 3 weeks before they filed the petition accusing me of manipulating Ruth. At that point, they already had a buyer, a price, and a deadline. Bennett rose. Your Honor, context is important. Judge Keene looked at him. Then I suggest your clients provide some. He sat down. I clicked once more. Elliot's final message filled the screen. Buyer won't wait forever. If you can get her suspended, I can push the sale before year end. That was the moment Troy stopped looking angry and started looking afraid, because the lie was no longer floating in the air. It had a timestamp. The timestamp did what my voice never could. It made the room stop treating Graham and Troy's anger as grief. But there was still one thing left. I had saved it because I hated that it existed. Not because it helped me, though it did. Not because it was dramatic, though it would become that. I had saved it because once I played it, Ruth would no longer belong only to my memory. Her voice would become evidence, and something about that felt unfair to her. Judge Keene looked at me over her glasses. "Do you have another exhibit, Miss Ellison?" I stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." Helen Whitcomb was seated 2 rows behind me. She gave one small nod, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. The clerk accepted the flash drive from my hand and connected it to the courtroom monitor. For a few seconds, the screen stayed black. I heard Troy shift in his chair. I heard Bennett exhale through his nose. I heard my own pulse in my ears. Then Ruth appeared. She was sitting in Helen's conference room, wearing a soft gray sweater and the pearl earrings she only wore when she wanted people to take her seriously. Her hair was thinner than it had been, her hands folded carefully on the table, but her eyes were clear, completely clear. Helen's voice came from off-camera. "Ruth, can you tell me why you asked to make this recording?" Ruth looked straight ahead. "Because my family has a habit of rewriting women after they are no longer in the room." No one moved. She continued, slow but steady. She identified the trust. She named the medical building, the cabin, the accounts, the scholarship fund. She explained that I had driven her to appointments but had never sat in on legal decisions. She said Helen had questioned her privately every time. Then Helen asked, "Why appoint Mara as trustee?" Ruth's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Because Mara understands the difference between managing money and draining it." Across the aisle, Graham's face tightened as if the words had physically struck him. Ruth looked tired then, but not confused. Never confused. "She never asked me what she would get," Ruth said. Graham asked what could be sold. Troy asked how soon. Mara asked whether I had my own lawyer. My throat closed. I stared at the table because looking at the screen hurt too much. Then Ruth said the sentence that ended it. "If Graham says this was manipulation, ask him why I had to be confused before he could call himself fair." The recording stopped. The silence afterward was enormous. Bennett stood, but he did not sound like the man who had entered that courtroom. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "we will not continue pursuing the undue influence claim." Judge Keene did not rule immediately. She let the words settle first, the way good judges do when a room has heard more truth than it expected. Bennett sat down slowly. Troy stared at the screen even though Ruth was gone from it. My father looked at the table, his mouth slightly open, as if he were still waiting for a version of the day where he could talk his way back into being right. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was steady. "The petition to suspend Mara Ellison as trustee is denied. The claim of undue influence is dismissed. The Ruth Calder Trust shall remain in full force according to its written terms." No one gasped. No one shouted. Real endings are rarely as theatrical as people imagine. They arrive in ordinary sentences, entered into the record by someone who has seen too many families mistake inheritance for love. Then Judge Keene turned another page. "Costs associated with this proceeding will be assessed against the petitioners." Troy closed his eyes. Graham did not move. I thought that was the end, but there was one final folder in my bag. Not the thickest, not the loudest. The one I had almost left at home because part of me was tired of exposing people who had already exposed themselves. I stood. "Your Honor, there is one additional matter related to undisclosed transfers and attempted disposition of trust property." Bennett's head lifted. Graham finally looked at me. I handed the folder to the clerk. Bank memos, email chains, the undervalued buyer offer, a timeline showing how the transfer request, the pressure on Ruth, and the effort to suspend me all pointed in the same direction. Judge Keene reviewed the first few pages. Her expression hardened. "These materials will be forwarded for appropriate review," she said. That was all. Careful words. Professional words. But everyone in the room understood what they meant. This was no longer just a failed family lawsuit. Troy turned toward our father. "You told me she stole from us." Graham said nothing. That silence did what no argument of mine ever could. It let Troy hear the truth without my voice attached to it. Outside the courtroom, my father caught up to me near the elevators. For a second, he looked smaller than I remembered. "I didn't think you'd come this far," he said. I held the strap of my gray bag and looked at the man who had laughed when I arrived alone. "You laughed because I came alone," I said. "You never understood that alone was how you raised me." After that, I stopped waiting for him to answer. The first Ruth Calder nursing scholarship was awarded the following spring. I kept the Brainerd cabin. I changed the locks. Some weekends, I sat on the dock and listened to the water move under the boards. I had won in court, but the real victory was quieter. I no longer needed the people who underestimated me to admit I was worth seeing. The lesson Mara learned was not that family can hurt you. Most of us learned that earlier than we should. The deeper lesson was that love without respect can become another kind of control. Sometimes, the people who raised you believe they own the right to define you. They remember the quiet version of you, the younger version, the version who apologized just to keep the peace. And when you finally stand up straight, they call it betrayal because they were more comfortable when you were small. But your value is not decided by the loudest person in your family. It is not measured by who believed in you first, who clapped for you, who ignored you, or who needed you only when there was something to gain. Your worth is built in the private moments no one sees. The mornings you keep going, the skills you sharpen, the truth you protect, the dignity you refuse to surrender. Mara did not win because she became cruel. She won because she stayed clear. She did not destroy her family. She simply stopped letting them use the word family as a weapon. And maybe that is what resilience really is. Not revenge, not bitterness, not proving every person wrong until they finally apologize. Resilience is learning to stand in a room where no one came with you and still know you are not empty-handed. You carry your work, your memory, your scars, your boundaries, your truth. So, if this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to stand alone against people who should have stood beside you? If you believe stories like this matter, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember this. Being underestimated does not make you weak. Sometimes it means they never knew what you were becoming.